Hello Ocean, it's me Riley. And before we get started today, I would just like to say thank you for the great semester. It was my first attempt with online classes and you made the best of an unfortunate situation. So today we are going to be talking about fiscal policy and how the government uses it to reduce economies' cyclical fluctuations. Before we dive into fiscal policy, I would like to touch up on a couple of things. When we're talking about an economy, there can really only be three things going on. There could be a recessionary gap, which is a negative output gap where our actual output here is smaller than our potential output there. The economy could have an inflationary gap, which is a positive output gap where our actual output is greater than our potential output. Or the economy could be at full employment, which is exactly where we want it, with our actual output equaling our potential output. Now that we know that, let's dive right into fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the use of government tax and spending policies to achieve government objectives, meaning that government spending and taxes are the two tools to fiscal policy. You see, all levels of government add directly to the expenditure function through their purchases of goods and services, whereas tax will enter the aggregate expenditure function through its effect on disposable income and consumption. Any policy used to stabilize those positive or negative output gaps I touched on earlier are called stabilization policies. Fiscal stabilization policy is fundamentally a short-term policy and it is used in response to various shocks. There are also automatic stabilizers that automatically speed up or slow down the economy. For example, we have the Canadian tax system or unemployment insurance. Before we start putting everything we've learned to work here, I must tell you one more thing about fiscal policy. We can have expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy are laws that are put in place to increase output by increasing government spending or decreasing taxes. Think of expansionary fiscal policy as the gas. Contractionary fiscal policy are laws that are put in place to decrease inflation by decreasing government spending or increasing taxes. Think of contractionary fiscal policy as the brakes. So now that we know the basics of fiscal policy, let's put some of this knowledge to some graphs and see how a government can use fiscal policy to stimulate an economy out of a recession. So here we have an economy in a recession with a negative output gap. Now we could tell it's a negative output gap because our actual output is less than our potential output. So the government needs to increase our aggregate demand to get us to our full employment. So how a government can increase aggregate demand using fiscal policy is by increasing government spending, which is a shifter of aggregate demand, so that will increase aggregate demand up to aggregate demand 1 there, or they can lower the taxes. Now, lowering taxes is not a shifter of aggregate demand. However, by lowering taxes, we're increasing our consumers' disposable income, which is increasing consumer consumption, which is a shifter of aggregate demand, so that will too shift to AD1. Now, I want you to note that changes in government prices have a greater effect on aggregate demand because part of the tax cut is always saved by consumers. And one last thing to remember, in a recession, we're trying to speed up the economy, we're trying to stimulate it, we're pressing on that gas, so it is an expansionary fiscal policy. So now that we know how fiscal policy is used to get out of a recession, let's see how it's used to get out of inflation. So we could tell we have an inflationary gap here because our actual input is lower than our potential. It's quite simple as it's just the exact opposite. We have to lower the demand. To lower aggregate demand, you can decrease government taxes, or government spending, or you can increase taxes, which decrease disposable income, decrease consumer consumption, and decrease aggregate demand. Remember, we're slowing this economy down, so that is contractionary fiscal policy. That concludes my presentation on fiscal policies. Once again, I wanted to say thank you, Ocean, and happy holidays.